Good morning, everyone. This is Dan Bouchard with Remax Realty Group's DC office, and I want to welcome you this morning to a discussion on buyer agency agreements in the Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors footprint, which is Montgomery County, Maryland, and Washington, DC. So it is only for those two jurisdictions. If you're looking for other documents that are more pertinent to other jurisdictions, please refer to those. I started out this series of classes with the description of what agency is and the relationship between a consumer and the real estate agent. And you can refer to those videos that are in my channel for further elaboration on those topics. We're not going to discuss those topics here. We're simply going to talk about the buyer agency agreement and the forms that go into it and the parts of it. And we're going to go into detail. This discussion is for consumers as well as for licensees. And so I encourage you to engage with the video, stop it, start it, rewind it, and use it as you need to. And we will probably do some revisions to this video later on. But for now, this is where we're going to start out. So this is not a legal discussion. I am not an attorney. This is solely based on my 26 years of experience. I am licensed in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and today's discussion is going to be with DC and Montgomery County buyer agency agreements. So I want to welcome you and thank you very much. If you have questions and you need to reach me, feel free to give me a call at 202-309-2339 or adb@goodvibehomes.com. Thanks so much. And we are going to begin this class. All right. So we're going to start out here and we're going to be using zip forms and Authentisign because that is the format that is most common for most brokerages. But you may have a different provider. There's other forms of SkySlope, there's DocuSign, there's DigiSign, all kinds of other different formats for not only managing your documents but also for getting getting e-signatures on your documents. All right, we're going to start out with a brief discussion about what's needed before you start the buyer agency agreement in Maryland. We're then going to shift into a discussion of what DC law requires, and then we'll get actually into the discussion about the buyer agency agreement itself. All right, when we're in Maryland and we've picked up the phone and we have engaged in a conversation for the first time with a real estate agent and let's say a buyer. We're going to use a buyer as an example, but this same principle applies to a seller. So if we are a buyer and a listing agent who have now just picked up the phone and started talking to each other, it's important to understand that relationship, referring back to the videos that I taught previously, go and check my channel for those videos to get educated on the jurisdictions. That relationship is a customer relationship, not a client relationship, which is a client relationship is a higher level of service compared to a customer relationship. So in a customer relationship, the agent is obligated to be completely honest with the person that they're speaking to, but that's about it. That's about it, the end of where the loyalty, that's about the end of the obligations of the relationship occur. And there are some subcategories of understanding of what honesty means. We're not going to get into that right now. We're just going to go ahead and understand that this is, we are now a customer situation. And because we are a customer situation in Maryland, Montgomery County is what we're talking about. We're going to be using this form for the buyer to be able to understand what the nature of the relationship is between the buyer and the agent that they're speaking to. So there are some definitions here that we've discussed in the previous videos. We are going to talk about here. And so what I will be doing here, let me just make this a little bit bigger so we can make it clearer. All right, so understanding whom the real estate agent represents, this notice is not a contract. So This is not something that has any binding effect on anybody. It is simply a disclosure that informs the consumer what the nature of the relationship is. So there's some definitions here of what a seller agent is, what a sub agent is, and we've discussed those in other videos. So I'm not going to go over that right now. Please refer to those videos for that discussion. We've also discussed, come on. All right, we've also discussed what a buyer's agent is. We've discussed and oh, let me back up here. So make sure that you understand that if you are viewing a property and you have not signed a buyer brokerage agreement, that agent represents the seller. So that seller, by default, the Maryland law has it that an agent who does not actively represent a buyer by way of a written and signed buyer agency agreement, by default, is actually representing the seller. So it's important for you as a consumer, if that is you, to understand that by default, all agents who are working with buyers are working, in fact, for the seller in Maryland, and by default are not actually working for you. So there's a presumption there in a lot of minds of the consumer that think, well, this agent has to be protecting my interests. And in fact, that's not true. That by law, the agent is obligated to be looking out for the seller's interests until they have a buyer agency agreement. So once you do have a buyer agency agreement, we are going to go ahead and be in this scenario here. There is a discussion about dual agency. I'm not going to get too far into this because we did it in other classes. So one of the things that is important to understand is that if you do not want to be in a dual agency situation, where in Maryland, dual agency is defined as the brokerage is the dual agent, and the one agent would represent one party, but they cannot represent the opposing party in the same transaction. So as long as there is one broker and one agent serving either the buyer or the seller, that agent cannot represent the opposite party in that transaction. So if you're the buyer's agent, you can't be the listing agent. If you're the listing agent, you can't be the buyer's agent. Now, another agent in your company can be that opposing agent, but they cannot do so. And in a situation like that, the brokerage is in dual agency. So that's how Maryland law is defined with dual agency, and it is different than other states. So don't let that be confused. Dual agency in Maryland is what is designated agency in DC and in Virginia, for example. But we don't want to go too far into that because that gets to be a little bit of a rabbit hole. Just understand that Maryland's different than DC and Virginia. All right, so then we're going to go ahead and go over here. So here we're going to go ahead and assign some fields here, and I am going to work here, and I'm going to just go ahead and plug in some information here, because this is what we're going to do. So this is what you should see as a consumer when you are first when you have that first discussion with an agent, whether that is your first substantive conversation. Should be looking something like this. Max Realty Group is my company. And here we're going to put my name here. And then we are going to go ahead and assign some check boxes. So let's say here that we are assigning ourselves. So our I think I've assigned this person as the buyer with. This is the buyer one. So we're going to go ahead and make this checkbox here. Apply here to the buyer. And then we're going to go ahead and say that there's an understanding that I am let me back up here. Yeah. Come on. There we go. In that, because I do not have a buyer agency relationship at this moment, we are going to say that I and Remax Realty Group are representing the seller's interests, not your own. And then what we would do is we would have Guillaume Garnier sign that document here, and out of time and oops, see, auto date, and that would be that. So that's what that would look like. Oops, wait a minute, where are we? All right, so this form is going to be like this, and this is going to be disclosing to you who the agent is actually working for. So that's Maryland's procedure. If the consumer doesn't feel comfortable signing here, that's okay. The buyer's agent or the agent that you're speaking to, myself, I can go ahead and assign this. I can sign this document right here, and let's just go ahead and set my signature there. I can sign that, attesting to the fact that I gave you this form. So that's what the purpose of this form is. All right. So having said that, then we go up to the top of the page here, and we also are going to have a discussion about dual agency and where the obligations and the loyalties lie with dual agency in Maryland. And we are going to have a discussion about the important considerations before making a decision about dual agency. So it describes what dual agency is, and it talks about this. Now, what it tells you is that here are the duties of dual agency and versus intra-company agent. And an intra-company agent would be where the seller is represented by one agent in the company, the buyer is represented by the other agent in the company, and they cannot reveal privileged information to the opposite side, to their opposing sides, even within the company. So those are the dual agents, and the individual agents involved are the intra-company agents, and dual agents. Dual agency is the company itself. Only the broker receives compensation on the sale of a listing. It's not a relation. It's not an agreement between the brokerages, between the agents and the consumer. It's an agreement between the consumer and the brokerage. Here you would consent for dual agency. If a buyer or a seller does not agree to be in dual agency, the only other options for them to proceed would be for them to decline dual agency, wherein they would not be represented by an agent, and the agent that they're working with would be working against their interests. So that's really not an ideal scenario. Or the other alternative would be for that consumer to be referred to another agent, so that agent can represent their interests, whether that's a buyer or seller. All right. So here, this is what we're going to look like in Maryland. Now in DC, we are going to have a similar kind of a situation in that, there we go. We're going to have a similar kind of situation in DC, and so designated agency is what is dual agency in Maryland. So when we're talking about a brokerage that is one company, you've got a buyer's agent on one side and a listing agent on the other side, that is going to be designated agency. So in a situation like this, I am going to assign a buyer, and we're going to insert a checkbox, we the undersigned buyers. I'm going to insert my name here. Come on now. I'm going to change this to me, and then I'm going to put my name here. I'll probably add another box here come on, to add my license number, and I can just type that. I'm just going to add a bunch of numbers in there right now, just for the sake of time. And then we're going to add another text box here. Come on. Come on, behave. There we go. All right, and we are going to assign this as the company is Remax, Remax Realty Group. All right, so that's going to be the brokerage firm that's representing that's going to be who we are right now. So in this instance, when we have just picked up the phone and we just started talking with each other as a buyer and an agent, we do not have an agency relationship. And again, we are a customer. We're in a customer kind of a relationship. Prior to providing specific real estate assistance, District of Columbia law requires that a licensee disclose to any party who the licensee does not represent the identity of the party to the proposed transaction, which the licensee does not represent. Even though a licensee may not represent you, the licensee must still treat you with honesty in the transaction. So that's similar to what we discussed in Maryland in that respect. So that's why we're doing this. So this form is doing that disclosure. So here we're going to go ahead and proceed this way. We're going to go back here and we're going to have a check mark here and this check mark, because at this moment we do not have an agency relationship with the consumer. By default, we're going to just go ahead and assume that we are representing the seller's interest. And then from there, we will go ahead and add an acknowledgement that the buyer must sign here. And we're going to assign an auto date here. And that's where this form gets completed. So, and again, here's a provision that says that I certify that on this date, I delivered a copy of this disclosure to the above identified individual. So same thing applies. If the consumer doesn't feel comfortable signing this, I can go ahead and assign this here with my own signature, attesting to the fact that I did in fact give the consumer this disclosure. This is the document that is saved. It is in the file as an evidence that we had this disclosure so that there's no misunderstandings. All right. So now that is the nature of establishing the pre-disclosures in Montgomery County, Maryland in general, and in DC. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back up here and we're going to start talking about the buyer agency agreement. And by the way, this class is going to be divided up into a couple of different sections, depending on, in the interest of time. I'm going to try to keep this class limited to about 30 to 45 minutes in length. So we will break this up into sections to discuss all the terms of the buyer agency agreement. So again, we are referring here to the agreement, and it's made on, we're going to enter in a date here on the top line, the buyer's name, and it's typically common for the buyer to have shown evidence of who they actually are by virtue of a driver's license or something like that. Here, the brokerage name will be Remax Realty Group in my case, but a different brokerage would put a different name there. And then here I would put my own name as the agent, who is about to be representing the consumer, who will now be a customer once this document is signed and ratified by both sides. So in consideration of the services provided, the broker is hereby granted the right to represent the buyer in the purchase, option, or exchange of real property or cooperative units. All right. So this agreement establishes that there is a brokerage relationship, an agency relationship as defined by the state that we are operating in, either DC or in Maryland. So Maryland law and DC law defines that, whichever one we are actually operating in. And it also defines the contractual obligations between the buyer and the broker, in which the broker has the exclusive right to represent the buyer under the terms of the contract. So it is an exclusive relationship. As a consumer, you don't want multiple people, multiple agents, multiple companies attempting to represent your interests. You want to have one agent that will get to know your needs, get to know your scenario, and establish that solid relationship that will become a deep and profound fiduciary relationship that will then be able to take you into an understanding and a better representation of your services. Having multiple relationships is not something that this allows for. You should only have one agent at a time, and having other relationships, other buyer agency relationships, that is not something that we work with. We only work with one buyer agency relationship at a time, just like a listing agent will only typically, if it's an exclusive agency situation, have only one agent representation at one time. So that's important that we make sure we understand that. So in section number 2, the broker responsibilities, the agent and the broker agree to use professional knowledge and skills to locate, present real property, which is available for purchase and suitable for the buyer's needs, to assist the buyer through the process of property acquisition, represent the interests of the buyer in all negotiations and transactions regarding the acquisition of the real property, notwithstanding the fact that the agent may receive compensation from other parties. So that also includes the fiduciary responsibility of privacy and loyalty in the nature of the relationship. So that's what we as licensees are required to offer the consumer. The buyer's responsibilities, that the buyer will work exclusively with the broker during the term of this agreement and will contact agent first with any questions or showing requests about properties, and not the seller or any other agent. So if you as a buyer are going to have questions about any property, you're agreeing to contact your buyer's agent, myself in this situation, and ask your questions to my buyer's agent and let me filter those out for you, and not contact the actual seller or the seller's agent, or the listing agent. And that is because you really need to have that channel to protect your rights, and to protect your fiduciary loyalties, to protect your fiduciary interests, because you may very well say something to a listing agent that could very much reveal some things that you don't really want them to know. It could reveal your motivations, it could reveal your flexibility, and in a lot of cases, those things, what you say can and will be used against you. You've heard that kind of phrase before. That's exactly why you don't want to be communicating with the sellers or with the listing agents. You want to prevent that through your buyer's agent. Okay, at open houses, buyer agrees to notify the party representing the seller of this agreement. So if you're planning on going to open houses, let me know about that. That's what that's all about. For new home builders and new home open houses, buyer agrees to make any first visit to any new home builder model only while being accompanied by an agent. And this is very important, because in a new home construction scenario, a lot of these builders will not honor the relationship that we have between the brokerage and the buyer. If you've visited the property, signed in, and given them your name, that is considered a registration, and that establishes you as their procuring cause, their procuring, and they will probably fight our ability to have you represented by me and my company if you have visited them that way. It's a new construction is a hostile environment for consumers in a lot of ways. This is just one of the ways that they will oftentimes try to circumvent our relationship. So please don't go out and don't go out and visit new construction properties without having me present. Okay. Buyer will furnish broker with necessary financial and personal information to reasonably establish the buyer's ability to purchase property and authorizes the release of such information to the seller and to the seller's broker. So only that information which is absolutely necessary, and only that information which is authorized by the buyer can we discuss with the other side. So we can't, if you tell me that I'm willing to pay $1 million for this $500,000 property, I can't turn around and tell that to the listing agent or to the seller. I have to keep that information private. And there are some very strict limits with what we can disclose to the other side about given your financial situation and stuff. All right. Next section we are talking about is the broker compensation. So this is a confusing topic, all right? So I want you to understand that in order for you to be represented in this transaction, this is an agreement between the brokerage and yourself. And the brokerage and the agent involved, myself in this situation, we are needing to have reassurances that we're going to get some money, we're going to get paid when this is all said and done. And in our situation, I am an independent agent. I am an independent contractor, and I don't get paid a dime until I have a successful transaction. So I'm investing my energy and my time into you as a consumer. And so I want to have reasonable assurance that I'm going to have some way of getting paid out of the transaction. And so bear with me as we're going to discuss this, because you may want to jump ahead, and but trust me, it'll all make sense in a couple of minutes when we talk about it a little bit more. So we are looking to you as the buyer to receive the compensation from you for the services that we provide as the buyer agent. So here we will go ahead and enter a numerical value here, and either as a percentage or as a specific dollar amount. And that fee is payable at settlement of any property contracted to be purchased during the term of this agreement, no matter who locates the property, even if located entirely by the buyer. And part of the reason for that is understanding that, the buyer, only one part of the finding the property is a very, very small part of the overall picture of what the buyer agent does for the buyer. It's a very tiny portion of it. And a lot of times we get bogged into the mindset that, well, that's the main aspect. And really it's not. The main aspect is really significantly getting that transaction negotiated and ratified to a contract, to a point that it is accomplishing the objective, but at the same time attempting to protect the buyer's interests financially, legally, and ethically in getting their objectives done in that way. So it's always a balancing act between getting the deal done and doing so without giving away all of the buyer's rights and privileges. So in consultation with the buyer's agent negotiates this agreement and proceeds that way. So proceeds through the negotiation. So so our compensation comes from you. And in most cases, the seller pays the commission. So what we're talking about here is that even though our agreement is with you, if the property is listed in the MLS, there is a, and I can just go ahead and show you this, continue this. I'm going to go ahead and go back here, and I'm going to show you something. Didn't mean to close this. All right, let's go back here. Let's just go ahead and pull up any old listing. Just as an example. So Washington, D.C. Results. Okay, I don't even know whose this is. I don't know what this is. Okay, some kind of property. So this is at 1451 Belmont Street. So actually this is a parking lot. So in this transaction, you will see that there is an indication down here of 2.5% in this particular one. So in this particular case, this listing company has negotiated with the seller of this property to pay a commission of 2.5% of the gross sale price of this property when at settlement. And that is paid on behalf of the buyer. So the seller is agreeing to pay the listing brokerage a commission amount. In this case, they're talking about 2.5%, and they are pointing to the fact that that commission is payable to a buyer's agent. Remember, we showed payable to buyer agency compensation here. All right. So in that case, payable to the buyer to cover the buyer agent's compensation. And so what you may find here is that this amount may or may not, this amount and this amount, depending which one they use, if it's a percentage or if it's a dollar amount, may or may not cover the entirety of what is offered in the listing. So in this case, that listing is offering a 2.5% commission, and in our compensation might be X. So it may cover more, may cover less. Just be aware that there is that's the difference there. Is what we would really want to pay attention to, what happens with the rest of that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and discuss that. And then the payment shall be made with the seller and buyer's prior knowledge. So that's all disclosed in the MLS for each individual listing. And in the event the seller does not pay the total of the commission due, the buyer hereby agrees to pay the difference due to the buyer's broker up to the full amount. Buyer also agrees to pay additional commission in the amount of X at settlement, regardless of any seller payment of commission. So if there was an additional fee that my company was charging, that might be entered here. Buyer has paid in advance, so that buyer has paid an advance fee of some agents will actually require a retainer for the services provided. And so that is a possibility that could be entered there. It's not always used, but it could be done, which will be credited against the commission due. So we're going to stop the training here, and we're going to pick it up in the next session. We're going to pick that up here in about in a few at 10 o'clock. And so feel free to contact me at 202-309-2339 if you have questions with any of this, or adb@goodvibehomes.com. Thanks.